So welcome to all of you to our second workshop in setting up your own PBRN. I'm really grateful to be able to welcome Amy and Jerry to run this workshop and give us all their insights and their own experience in setting up their own PBRNs. So today we'll be working on ingredients that help assure success. So we'll be digging a bit more deeper into how to make this work. And I look really forward to hear you both talking about that. I think Jerry will start today's webinar. So the
Yeah,
floor is yours.
thanks, Paul. Good evening, everyone. Good morning, Amy. So in this session today, we are going to do a bit of a presentation, Amy and myself, but then we'll have quite a bit of time to discuss. So if you have any thoughts, we will have prompts for some questions for you at the end. But feel free to add anything in the chat, and then we can discuss all of that, or write it down somewhere, and then you can turn on your mic at the end of our presentation, which should be fairly brief, and then we can start interacting. So today is the second workshop, as it says already here, and we will be meeting for the ones who are interested, and I think we will discuss a little bit more about that later. In Heathrow in October, the 19th of October, which is the Thursday, following which will be the international conference on the Friday and Saturday, co-organized by ENCO, the University College of Osteopathy, the Institute of Osteopathy, and in collaboration with the Osteopathic International Association and Osteopathy Europe. So we will discuss about some of the opportunities that are possible when setting up your own PBRN, how crucial early engagement is, and then we'll have some discussion with you to try to support and answer any queries you might have at this stage. So very briefly, I thought I would recap what was discussed in May or whenever that was, the previous meeting, because just to make sure that we all have the sort of same ideas in our head when we use some of the terminology. So we saw that there are different ways that we can share information, and we can also engage with others, including clinicians and patients. And we discussed about different interventions that can be used, whether we're interested in having interventions that are mostly practice relevant, practice informed, or practice based. And obviously the webinars are mostly around the practice based aspect, practice based research network. The previous webinar is available on YouTube thanks to Paul's editing skills and putting it online. So you have access to it through this URL, but also if you can't remember where it is, you can go on the COM collaboration website, and then you will find the video embedded on the page there. So in essence, what we said last time was that if an organization decides to develop a practice-based research network, the idea is really to develop an infrastructure which will be available for multiple projects. If you are planning to do just one project with it, don't bother setting a practice-based research network. It's not worth the effort, and you are going to then do a normal project, which might be a randomized control trial, which might be a qualitative study, which might be observational, whatever sort of settings. And your recruitment of the clinicians and or patients will be as usual as when doing one of these designs. But if you're aware that developing that sort of infrastructure is useful, and we're going to see why in a minute, then setting up a PBRN is worth the effort on many levels. For PBRN to be sustainable, you will need to have some institutional support, and we'll discuss a little bit more about that in a minute, what that means. But it can't be yourself on your own setting up the PBRN for your whole country or your whole area region, because it needs financial support, but also it's a I was going to say disciplinary, that's not exactly what I mean, but multi-skill endeavor, which require to have quite a few people involved. And so that's why you need to have some sort of backup from your institution. And finally, there is a financial support that would be required for that PBRN to to work properly, and we'll talk about that. And even though it's not very high, or there's a sort of spectrum of how much money you can put into it, it can be quite a sort of low cost structure. There is still a need for having some financial support. So if you're planning to set up a PBRN, it's really important, I'm just repeating myself here, I do apologize, but that very early on, that you start getting support from the institution. And that is starting discussing with them, explaining what a PBRN is. And, probably from what we've shared in this webinar and the previous one, you have enough information to be able to explain that. But also I had to develop different project documents that I would be very happy to share with you. So if you drop me an email, I'm happy to send you any documents I did in the past for that. And your institution will be there to support you potentially financially if they have a small pot of money for that. It might be, if you work in this institution, to save some of your time for working on this PBRN, but they might have some IT support. If you have an ethics committee, it might support you into doing some projects with your PBRN. You might have other academics in your institution that might give you ideas, support. So there are lots of things, and all this sort of brainstorming and being able to work with others is very important. And this is where working, having support from your institution is quite important. But also it means that if in 2 years' time you decide to move to South America, then the PBRN can continue, because your institution can look for someone else who can continue working on it. So you don't have the burden of thinking, I can't move to South America because the PBRN is going to stop functioning. So, hey, freedom to your travel plans. But also, it's really important early on, once you have your institution support, I would say to start with that, to engage with funders and with clinicians. I will talk a little bit about our work at NCORE and what we've done so far and how we've done that. But that is likely to shape a little bit what your PBRN is going to look like. And without doing that, it's potentially going to be a good recipe for your PBRN to fail. So if you want to have money and if you want to have members in your PBRN, you need to talk to them very early. If you manage to set up a PBRN, I said earlier, it's a bit more fast than just doing one project and recruiting for that project. But there are reasons why PBRNs are being developed. One of them is, it looks good. You are going to demonstrate that you are a leader in your field, in your country, or in your area, and that you've been able to recruit, you've been able to set up, you've been able to implement policies and all of this. And this existing infrastructure is going to enable you to apply for funding for projects, which the cost is going to be a bit less than if you didn't have any infrastructure at all. So that is going to be quite attractive for funders to see that you can tap onto an existing infrastructure. And also because that demonstrates your network and your leadership position, that is also something that is going to be valued when assessing your application. And whilst there is a cost initially to set up your PBRN, once it's up and running, the ongoing cost is not that high. Can be very low, in fact, but it helps you to gather evidence in a very cost-effective manner. And there are different ways you can do that, by interacting with clinicians, collecting data on a regular basis, interacting with patients, but there are lots of different ways you can do that. On a side note, the research group of Osteopathy Europe are doing a workshop on the same day we will be doing our last workshop, which will be about supporting institutions. There are going to be twice the word support in my sentence. I do apologize in advance, but supporting organizations to support clinicians to use more evidence in practice. Sorry, that's a lot of support in this sentence. But what I'm trying to say here is that the PBRN can also be that. It can also be used as a way of interacting with clinicians and providing them tools to be able to implement evidence in practice or to take part in small research projects, rather than just being, the ones who collect data and things like that. So there are lots of different ways that it can be shaped, obviously. So as I said, we are still in our embryonic stage of developing a PBRN at NCORE. I started working on it, I think 2 years ago, roughly, and I started working on planning, trying to get a budget and trying to apply for funding and things like that. And in the last year or so, we've conducted a series of focus groups with clinicians throughout the 4 nations of the UK. No, that's not true. 3 nations. We didn't do Northern Ireland. 3 nations of the UK, with osteopaths who were in rural areas, some who were in cities, really to try to gather feedback from them about what were the pros and cons that they saw about joining a PBRN. What I'm going to present here are the extremely early stage of the analysis. So I'm not saying that what will be in our publication on the topic will be exactly that, but looking at the data and having conducted or taken part to almost all of the focus groups, that's what the team we feel is currently in the data. So one struggle that many osteopaths have voiced is the sort of social exchange of the patient coming to see you for help, giving you money so that you can help them, but you at the same time, you start asking them help to take part in a project. And this is something that a lot of osteopaths find very difficult, and they don't know how to reconcile this issue. So in order to ensure that recruitment for a project works well, then providing support to osteopaths about explaining why, how, providing tools and support, again, that's probably the 76th time I said support in this presentation, is going to be extremely important to ensure that your project is viable. So far, osteopaths were extremely positive about the project, but they were aware that their research skills were low. And therefore, they wanted to access training, which the PBRN is a fantastic tool for, because then you have access, you can do online training, you can do anything, you can do tailored training and everything. But one thing that also came across quite clearly during the discussions was that even the notion of evidence-based practice is still misunderstood by many osteopaths, because there was this sort of linger of an idea that there was a fear that if we were to develop a randomized control trial, it would dictate what osteopaths have to do with their patients, like almost like a protocol of treatment. And so, despite having explained based on the second model, of, the Venn diagram, of what is often considered with 3 or 4 bubbles of evidence-based practice, there was still this sort of worry that a PBRN might start dictating to osteopaths what they should do. The clinicians were very motivated to have free, high-quality CPDs. NCORE is an organization that is highly valued by osteopaths in the UK, and that is quite context-dependent, because in the UK, CPDs, which is continuing professional development, so short courses and things like that. This is mandatory for all osteopaths to do 30 hours of CPD per year. So accessing free CPD is always a bit of a something that is considered to be nice. They really like the idea that taking part in a PBRN doesn't mean that you're going to be dictated to recruit and to do things that you might not feel interested, but this sort of bottom-up research where clinicians might flag up gaps in the literature regarding, common practice elements of practice was also something that they really liked. And surprisingly to me, the financial compensation was not much of a problem. And they said if they were tasks which were really taxing time-wise, yes, they would need to be paid or reimbursed for their time. But otherwise, they were quite happy to take part in projects with no financial compensation. So for us, that is going to drive a little bit how we are going to try to recruit osteopaths to join our PBRN and to reassure them on some of these aspects, and also to sort of boost the sort of free high quality CPD, and you are going to be an actor into developing projects and things like that. So that's really something that came from our early analysis, which will be much more refined later, but that's where we are at the moment. So when developing a PBRN, we talked about your institution, that you will need to get them on board and stuff like that. And then, because if you remember how it works, you have the clinicians working with academics, and that's the sort of usual PBRN structure. And then in the mix, you can put patients. So you need to start thinking who will be the academics that will support your PBRN. Do they work in your institution? Do you have academics that have the skills to support you, which might be regarding IT, which might be regarding statistics, which might be research designs, research methodology. And if you don't have them in your institution, are there some in locally or in your country in osteopathy that might be interested in joining your PBRN? Or could you work with someone from a different profession that have these skills? And all of these answers or options are highly suitable. It all depends on your context and also your network, to be fair. But this is something that you don't want to work on a project for 9 months and then you have a massive roadblock because, well, you don't have any statisticians on board and you don't know how to, I don't know, calculate sample size, theoretical sample size, something like that. Then you have to also think, and that's not really urgent. That's something that can be considered a bit later when you start thinking about your standards operating procedure. But who will have access to your PBRN? I.e., let's say you have a PBRN, you have lots of osteopaths who decide to take part. You have this fantastic infrastructure available for people to do work with. Is that just for your institution? We would suggest it shouldn't. It should be almost like a sort of open access, obviously being careful with data sharing, GDPR, and all the likes. But ideally, your PBRN should be accessible to other researchers, maybe in your country or in your area. And that would require some processes in place so that they can apply maybe to access your PBRN. You can triage, you can screen what they want to do, whether it's in line with the values of your members and also the value of your PBRN. And for that, you might need to provide some information or maybe even training resources for researchers who want to apply for your PBRN. But this is something also quite important. I think if ultimately we're looking at training osteopaths, helping osteopaths, engaging more with evidence, helping patients to be able to voice what is important to them, then a PBRN should not be just for one institution. And I think being much more inclusive and open to sharing with others is something that is should be celebrated. How can we ensure a bottom-up approach where clinicians can bring some problems and gaps and stuff like that, but prevent numerous niche topics that are raised by members? So you might have an osteopath who is highly interested into a very rare hypermobility syndrome. And yeah, it's very interesting, but it's not very common. Is it worth spending resources onto that topic compared to another topic, which is another niche and thing like that? So again, there's probably some training to offer to the members to try to explain how resources tend to be limited in research, and even more research for osteopathy and other allied health professions or complementary and alternative medicine. and that projects have to be feasible, because if we look at a project, a condition that is very rare, then recruitment is likely to be highly challenging because we don't see many of patients with these conditions. And also, if we think about the impact it might have on practice, it might have little impact if it's something that we don't encounter very regularly. Saying that, there are concerns that osteopathy tends to focus too much on musculoskeletal research and mostly around low back pain, and that we should diversify. So these tensions, do exist and are part of sort of, regular discussions of osteopaths doing research, and are important to engage with your membership. But you have to think how that can be done well, and probably again training them to these sort of questions is important. So how to set up a project, what are the steps in research projects and things like that. We are currently developing open access resources for that, which are currently being gradually uploaded on the UCO CPD website and accessible for free. And obviously financial support, as already said. So for example, you might need a part-time administrator working on your PBRN, and the time might be very limited. It could, if it's a small PBRN, it might be a couple of hours a week. For us at NCORE, we got a research fellow who works 0.5 FTE, so 2.5 days a week on our PBRN. So it really depends on the scale of your PBRN and also what financial means you currently have. And then you might have to consider about applying for funding for specific projects that might be using your PBRN, i.e. your infrastructure. And or that might include maybe giving or paying the osteopaths if it's really taxing them time-wise. So I'm going to try something that I haven't done, which is slide control, and I will give that to Amy so she can continue the presentation.
Thank you so much, Jerry. And I'm glad you've been able to do that, because I was wondering how we were going to make this work. So that's wonderful. That was such wonderful sort of background information. And I'm really just going to focus on some of the experiences that we've had through our research group running PBRNs. And how we've gone about it, and some of the lessons that we've kind of learned along the way that seem to make a difference in terms of solving or addressing some of the needs that Jerry so beautifully outlined. So just to give you a little bit of context, just to the Australian landscape, for the just because it has informed how we've gone about how we've set up our PBRNs, and also to acknowledge that you also, in your own specific country or setting, will need to consider what your unique landscape is, which is why this workshop, this series of workshops have been set up to provide insights and information, but also really in the hope that it will help to inspire you to think about what might actually work for you in your area. So Australia, of course, we're very geographically spread. We've got, in some ways, but in other ways, we really aren't. A large proportion of our population lives on the eastern seaboard. We've got very significant rural and remote issues where we've got, very underserved health communities in very remote locations with, no one else living within 3 hours drive of them, kind of thing. The divide between what's available to people who live in urban areas and those who are rural, remote, very remote, is significant. And there's also no dedicated osteopathy research funding, or in fact, very little dedicated research funding for any particular health topic. The way that research funding works in Australia is it's all one big pot of money and everyone just applies for that one big pot of money. And so, of course, health professions or topics that have less, that are seen by decision makers as less relevant as some of the mainstream or biomedical dominant health professions, likely to get have to work a lot harder to get that funding. So osteopathic practice is somewhat variable. We've got different clinical environments and business models. It's usually, though, community-based. They're usually independent practitioners, although they might be working in a group with other osteopaths. They're less likely to be working in a team with other health professionals from other professions. So the research exposure and training varies a little bit as well. For a lot of the people who do get research training in their clinical degree, they're not really coming away impassioned by research. They're often doing it under duress, and as a result, they come out of it with a bit of resentment and determination to never do research again. So, and also in terms of integrating with existing health services systems and structures, the degree to which that's happening varies a little bit as well. So they're semi-integrated, I would say, but there are lots of areas where the connection between biomeds and the dominant health system and osteopathy isn't as strong as it probably could be. And certainly there's no osteopaths working in public hospitals, for example, and those kinds of things. So that's just for context now. Does that work? It does. All right. So in PBRNs, the way that when we first decided to set up a PBRN, we had a look at how things were being done at the time. And the most common way that was being done, US was absolutely the epicenter of PBRNs when we were setting them up, was they were using big data. They were working within established clinics, usually within attached to biomedicine. And these established clinics usually all had the same database that they were, or clinical file system, or actually tapping into a state or federal-based clinical system themselves. And as a result, a lot of the PBRNs were clinics signing on to having their data be accessible for analysis. So that's that, and it worked really well for all those particular circumstances in some ways. But when we reflected on it for Australia, we decided it actually wasn't going to work, particularly for the professions we were seeking to set up PBRNs for. It wasn't going to work for a few reasons. One was there's a cost associated. We knew that the professions we had, there was no guarantee they all had the same system. And so that meant that we would either have to pay for them to set up a system and ask them to change, a lot of individual clinicians to change their system across to the system that we wanted, which would also have a huge impact on their business viability and practicalities. There was a lot of logistical challenges with that. But either that or we were going to be asking them to make the change, which is also a cost to them. And so whilst there was some dominance, particularly within osteopathy, of some particular systems that were more popular, the way they were set up was different. They weren't networked in any way. There was huge cost barriers to actually making that happen. Also, when we thought about it, we thought, well, actually, big data is retrospective. Of course, you can collect data prospectively, but the thing about the way that this big data primarily works is it draws on the data that's already being collected in the system. And so it just means that if you think of a research question that's not being collected in the system, that data isn't being, that there's no way you can answer that research question. Even if it's just one or two elements that's not being collected in the system, you're relying on the data that's already there. You're also relying on the accuracy of day in, day out clinical practice and the clinicians who fill in those clinical files. I mean, within osteopathy, I see a wonderful osteopath in Australia, and I don't know that he writes a lot down after 20 years of clinical patients. You know, I'm sure there's a lot of the real gold of what it is that he does in his clinical consultations is stored in his head and in his hands. So that makes it a bit hard as well for osteopathy. And it also just means that you're confined to that data that is already in that data set. So we decided we wanted to take a different approach. And we decided what we wanted to do was to set up a PBRN that worked through a database of interested practitioners. And that allowed for multiple study designs, because the other thing, of course, about the big data is that you can find it not just to the data but also somewhat to the study design. When you're dealing with a certain type of data, you can only really do a certain type of study. And so we wanted much more diversity in what we did. And so we set up this sub-study approach to PBRNs, and that's the model that we've used. And I'll talk you through what that looks like briefly. But what the idea of those diverse research approaches that we've enabled is that it allows, when you look at the broad spectrum, and this has kind of developed a bit of a polarization or a spectrum of research approaches. We wanted to set up a PBRN that would enable as many of these types of research designs to be covered as possible. And so clinical trials, observational epidemiological type studies, social sciences research, all of those, we wanted them to be able to be covered through our sub-study design and through our PBRNs. And so this is the way that we did that was we asked the practitioners to join the PBRN database, so that we weren't asking them to sign on to all of their clinical files being accessed, just to join the database. And then we have researchers submit an expression of interest to conduct a sub-study through the PBRN. The PBRN steering committee reviews the expression of interest against the principles for the PBRN with the PBRN mission. The PBRN admin, once that's been approved by the steering committee, the PBRN admin sends an invitation out to its members, and then the PBRN members participate in that project. So there's a couple of things that we focus that are core principles around how that's conducted. One is privacy and confidentiality. We never give out the PBRN members' contact information to researchers. That's something that we manage at an administrative level centrally. We make it very clear to all PBRN members that their involvement in each project is optional. So they're invited to participate in a project. We've got a few projects currently going through some of our PBRNs at the moment, and they're quite different. But the thing about them as well is that, and so each member can make a decision, oh, this one's asking me to give handouts to my clients and asking them to complete a survey. I don't really feel comfortable with that, or the topic doesn't really interest me. I won't participate in that particular project. Oh, this one's asking me to complete a survey. I feel like I can do that. And so there's whatever that might be. This one's asking if I can actually be involved in a clinical study within my clinic and collect data from that perspective. That's a lot more of a burden. How much are they reimbursing me? Do I feel comfortable with that? All of that is optional for them to make their own decisions based on their personal circumstances, their clinical circumstances, and just the moment in time that the invitation hits their inbox. The research projects are reviewed for rigor and alignment with the PBRN mission by the steering committee. And why that is really important is because osteopaths, as Jerry pointed out, and as I've mentioned as well, a lot of the clinicians don't have a lot of experience with research necessarily. And some of them, particularly in Australia, can feel a bit nervous about how research is being conducted and if it's being used to help support better understanding of their profession or help to undermine the profession. There can be a little bit of uncertainty about that. So for them to feel confident that all of the ethical requirements have been met, that there's people who understand the osteopathic profession who are reviewing the project to make sure that what's being asked of them is in the remit of what an osteopath might be expected to do, and that the way the study design is set up isn't purposefully setting out to undermine osteopathy. And so there's a trust there that they know if it's come through us through their PBRN, then the study is a quality study and it's actually going to answer a question that's valuable and meaningful to the osteopathic profession. So once we've kind of set up our structure and our standard operating procedures, we then needed to get the practitioners involved. And one of the things that we started out with was very clear, was we needed, a name, we needed a logo, we needed something that they could identify with. And we had one these are just three of the examples of logos that we've had set up for PBRNs we've run. Alongside, once we had the logo set up, we needed websites and social media accounts and other things that allows, and these were primarily for the members although also serving the purpose for the researchers, but primarily for the members to give them an opportunity to engage, to follow what we're doing, for us to be able to document information to them. We also had, which I haven't got up on the slide there, we also had some was going out in some instances as well. We also did up a few, for some of them with the Pracky PBRN, we had some funding for stickers and posters and pens and things like that as well, which when they first signed up, they got sent a little sticker that they could put up on their clinic so that they could identify with the brand, but they actually advantage for them from a marketing perspective because they identified them as a research-oriented clinician. And that actually gave them as a little bit of branding as well as a certificate with their personal ID membership number that they could put up in a frame on their wall if they so desired. So one of the things that we did in terms of engaging membership was once people actually signed up, they got a certificate, they got some information sent out to them with a thank you letter for being involved, reiterating why it was so good, the Facebook page and all those kinds of things. It also had that sticker in it as well. And one of the things we asked people to do, because we had the Facebook page set up, is to send through and tag our Facebook page a photo of them with their certificate or with their sticker once they received it. And we got a really great response from the members at the time, sending through photos of themselves proudly showing their Pracky information up in their own clinic. And it was a really great way of sort of setting up the community for that PBRN. It landed really well, and it's got a really great reputation in Australia amongst the practitioners, partly because I think of this work. So as Jerry mentioned as well, CPD points can be a real difference. This is an example of what we did for Pracky because it was a multi-professional PBRN. So we had multiple health professions offering CPD points. And I think that's a thing to keep in mind as well. If you do have, even within osteopathy, if you have multiple professions that people might be commonly seeking CPD points for, it's worth engaging with those organisations. And there's lots of, and this is part of where Jerry's point is start early with a lot of this stuff. PBRNs, I mean, we're running 3 workshops on them for people who've got a bit of an idea already of what they might be. So a lot of the people you're going to be talking to have very little idea about research, have never heard of a PBRN before. And so there's a lot of work involved in actually helping them to understand what the value of it is, so they can understand why supporting it is such a good idea from their organization's point of view, from the researcher's point of view, whatever it might be. So, there's, depending on how many organizations are relevant for your setting and context, make sure you give yourself the time. And particularly because you're potentially giving yourself the time, certainly with one of our PBRNs, Acorn, which was the chiropractic one, we had 2 very competitive chiropractic associations that were not really very friendly with each other. We had to try and convince to get on board when one of them was the one funding the PBRN. And so we had to convince that one that getting the other association involved was a good idea. And we had to convince the other association that being involved was a good idea. And there was a lot of talking involved with that as well. And certainly, but we felt that it was because they had about a 60-40 split of their health profession. And so not having half of that health profession engaged in any way with what was going on with the PBRN wasn't really going to give a good representation of the profession, and didn't give us access to as many clinical sites as possible. So the other thing that we did, again, this is just using Pracky as an example, was we developed some Pracky ambassador series. And these were, we picked out well-known practitioners that have had a very strong profile and developed a series of videos in which we had them talking about why being involved in Pracky was worth doing. These were people that a lot of people would go and see as a main speaker at a conference. They would go and attend the symposiums that they're being offered, the private workshops and those kinds of things. They were very famous within the professions that they were representing. And these videos, we put them together and we just shared them out through social media to help understand the way, I guess, that the pracky will work and the value it offers the profession and what it would mean for them and why they themselves as active clinicians were involved or choosing to be involved in pracky. All of this work, this sort of work was done before we even started actually inviting people to be members of pracky. So this was part of the getting people aware of it. Another body of work that we did to help get the awareness out about pracky was publications. So there we go. We wrote up methodology projects. Now this was for the researchers. This was so when we would go and meet with researchers and help them to understand what pracky or what the PBRN would be, how they were going to work, how the researchers could get involved. We had it all written up in a peer-reviewed manuscript so that we could give them, which of course is a very important currency for a researcher. We also have written all sorts of documentation or publications for practitioners. So this went into a practitioner journal attached to one of the professional associations. For osteopathy, we also included in the professional newsletter journal. So it was not a peer-reviewed journal. It was the one that kind of went out with just articles about things. And so we had featured articles in those, as well as some direct communication from the president of the Osteopathy Association going out to his members talking about why it's so important, why people should get involved. A direct communication from the CEO talking about it. Different communications at different times, lots of awareness raising. Once we'd set up the PBRN, we also published an overview descriptive paper of the membership, just a high-level paper of the membership of the PBRN, so that we could point people to it. They could get a very general idea about how many people were in there, what their general characteristics were, where they were located, so the researchers could start to think about what projects they might be able to conduct through the PBRN. And it also meant that, and it was something that people were often citing as well as when they were presenting in the methods section of the sub-studies that they presented, and they'd cite the PBRN as what they used. They would reference this paper as kind of the source of that. And so the other thing about these two papers, this sort of paper, the one that looks at, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor actually, the paper that looks at describing the PBRN setup into the top left corner, and then the types of papers that describe this actual membership. Both of those also meant that people writing up about the PBRN could provide a more summarized methodology and refer back to these ones as well, so they didn't have to provide a detailed description in the method section of their manuscript. So just a few measures of success for Orion, which is the osteopathy PBRN that we've been running now since 2018. And these are we've just recently put some of this together for a report, so I had this available. So of course, we have 992 osteopaths who have signed up to Orion. Now it's about to go through a relaunch. So this is when it was set up in 2018. That's 5 years. That's, well, it's actually 2017 when we did the recruitment, but we're currently going through the process of getting ethics approval to renew our membership. Now, you can do a rolling membership with PBRNs. We choose not to, because it makes it hard for us to keep track of exactly who is there and what the characteristics of those members are. It just means that we have to, and it takes time. We just decided we're going to focus on recruiting members and managing that database really well, and then having another wave of recruitment at a later stage. We've produced the PBRN as a result of work done through the PBRN. More than 20 publications have been produced in 5 years, and 5 original sub-studies. So that's 1 a year on average, and that's not saying that one has happened every year, but that's averaging out as 1 a year, including during a pandemic. So that's activity. Those original sub-studies as different to the 20 publications, because we also make the data set of membership de-identified available for secondary analysis. Because when we set up our PBRNs, we send out a survey that helps to capture the characteristics of the profession, so that we can do targeted invitations for sub-studies. If someone wants to do a sub-study, I think I've got it on the next page, on say someone did something on telehealth And so they could target in on people who said that they used some kind of telehealth, for example, in their practice, and just invite those people, so we're not burdening the entire membership base. So in addition to that, that's part of the reason we collect that information, but the data is also available for secondary analysis. And so we also have a lot of early career researchers in osteopathy in Australia accessing that data and using it to get preliminary information to justify getting maybe internal funding to do an original sub-study or something like that as well. So there's that opportunity. We also had a look at the degree of collaboration that was arising from the work being done through Orion. And you can see UTS, that's our team. Now, obviously, there's a lot of UTS authorship, but you'll also notice not all papers, not all authors involve someone from UTS as well. So it's not a requirement from our PBRN that someone from our team is on it. It's just for a lot of the people who are being involved, as I said, they were early career researchers and they valued having someone who was more experienced contributing to the paper. And of course, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 that are very dominant here. These are the institutions in which there is a course in osteopathy. So we've got RMIT, University of Melbourne doesn't have a course, but they have 1 or 2 osteopaths who are in their program who are very, very prolific, who are very motivated early career researchers and have really committed to doing this work. But Victoria University and Southern Cross University. So these are the 3 courses, and this is actually just one individual really who's just been really, really active. All right, but it's interesting as well to see that we've also ended up with other institutions being brought into publication as well. So these are people who are non-osteopath researchers being invited to collaborate because the data is there, the projects are there through the PBRNs as well. So that's another really great, we think an evidence of success, because I know as a non-osteopath who's working in this field, one of the most common questions I used to get asked is, why are you involved in osteopathic research? You're not an osteopath. And, I'm also involved in midwifery research. I'm involved in a few areas of research. But I think it's one of those questions of osteopaths needs to stop asking those questions, because it is a valid area of research. You don't need to be an osteopath to research osteopathy. You absolutely need to understand osteopathy, and you're going to get the best results by collaborating with osteopaths. But you absolutely want the expertise, the different perspectives, and the different methodological skill sets that comes from bringing people in from outside. And the PBRNs can be a great vehicle for making that more attractive for non-osteopaths to do the work. So I also just want to give you an idea from our sub-studies, what our participant response rates are. So these are the 5 that we did. This one was about evidence-based practice using a validated instrument, and we had about a 35% response rate of the people who were sent the invitation and the people who actually responded. So it's 35%. We also, we had one asking about their attitudes to pain and pain management, and that was about 22%. In terms of visceral techniques, you can see you're moving into a somewhat more niche area now. But it was sent out to all of the osteopaths, because we didn't actually have any specific questions about visceral techniques in the baseline study. And so it was sent out to all the members, not just, we weren't able to target people just doing visceral techniques. But even so, that was about 15% response rate, or 17%. Oh no, 15. And the PROMs, I'll come back to clinical experience one. The PROMs was also around 15% response rate. Now, with health professions, getting even a 10% response rate of a sample is considered a good outcome. And what you're seeing here is just as much people's, as I said, that optional involvement. It's not a good time for me. I'm really busy in clinic right now and those kinds of things. But just to be able to have one email that you can send it to and get the participation involved, and that's really great. This one is very low, but the reason that one's very low is because it was a different study. We weren't looking for practitioners to directly engage with the study themselves. What we were looking for is for the practitioners to invite their patients to complete the survey. So we only needed 8 or 10 sites in order for that to go ahead. And more than, when you're doing a multi-center study like this, more than 5 sites is considered a really great outcome. To reduce participant load, we aim for 10 to 15, and that if we're getting maybe 20 patients to complete a survey, that still gives us a good few hundred responses, but it doesn't put a huge burden. And most osteopaths, they can give out that many flyers in a week with their. But anyway, just a few measures of success and challenges in some way, but that's kind of some of the. Happy to unpack any of that in more detail, and I'm sure there are other things that will come up as well as we go through the Q&A. But thank you very much for listening and for your patience while I disappeared unexpectedly.
Thank you very much, Amy. This was really, I think it really gives us some really clear insight on the before, the during, and the after. And I think that's really interesting. I've got a posted answer from Suad Alanzi, who asked, can you give some more precisions on what type of associations you are thinking of? Oh, no, that's all right. How can you join the associations? And he was talking about acupuncture and Chinese medicine. So I'm not really sure when it was during the slides.
Been a miss. So that the set of associations that I had up with those associations was for a PBRN that was for a range of complementary medicine health professions. So the reason we had an acupuncture and Chinese medicine association on that list is because we were recruiting acupuncturists into the PBRN. And so for the sake of osteopathy, you would focus just on the ones that the osteopaths were most commonly involved in.
I don't know if he's asking like an interest in creating a PBRN and whether we want associations to contribute to the PBRN or at least support it. To answer that question, I think it's having also knowing about these people, going around congresses and having someone that's involved within an association, and then just talking about it with them, and then they can just link you to the different people within the associations. I think it's way easier having personal relationships or indirect personal relationships. So knowing someone who knows someone who's in there, because it creates a more trustful dynamic to start the talk. And I will put up a question answer live. Gerard had I don't know if you can see the question, but wonderful presentation, many important things to take into account. Given your experience, it would be great to have some sort of step-by-step guideline of recommendations, starting with the most basic ones, ideally also considering the specific problems that we can anticipate in countries where osteopathy is not regulated. So I don't know if, Jerry, if you want to take that one to start off with.
Yeah, sorry, I was reading the question. So is the step-by-step guideline for starting the air? So, well, the approach we took, which was, I was very lucky to have met Amy before starting the PBRN. So I got lots of, support and good idea and, advice from Amy. Which then we implemented, and that include what was already said about early discussions with others, including partners, including clinicians. The support for the institution for us was quite easy because I had that straight away. I also had support from, and obviously I've lost the name and it will come back in a sec. Fantastic chiropractor in Denmark. I think it's Denmark. Her name would come back.
Jan.
No, it's a woman. I mean, she does work with Jan. He'll come back. Anyhow, and she set up her PBRN in Denmark, if Denmark it is. And also, she was very generous with her time and giving advice. And having these sort of, brainstorming sessions with people who had experience with developing PBRNs sort of highlighted many aspects I hadn't considered initially. So I would suggest, if you want to set up a PBRN, feel free to reach these people, because a lot of them are very happy to do a half hour or even an hour Zoom meeting to give some of these sort of golden nuggets of what to do and not to do. Another thing is we learned a lot my colleague Dan, who is, I think, in the meeting, who is going to be managing the PBRN at NCORE, from the literature, because, you know, Amy mentioned a few papers on PBRNs. We found quite old ones also about the sort of early PBRNs that were developed, which were quite interesting, and also much more modern ones about the different ways these can be set up. And we learned a lot from that. So, you know, going back to the literature, but also talking to people who had Alice Kongstead. I knew it would come back her name. That's the I think Danish chiropractor. We learned a lot from that. I can't really do a step-by-step guideline more than, you know, what we sort of discussed about, you know, starting with the different aspects we recommended now.
Maybe, Jerry, on that point, I think from your experiences in your talk, it was, and what we saw from last webinar, is that PBRNs can be specific to different types of needs. So there's not two PBRNs that probably be set up the same way. So I think it's one taking insight. And the third workshop that we are organizing in London is specifically to be able to gain insights from other people to answer these questions. The material we are talking about, like publication, I think it's good that we make it available to the group so that you can read it. But when we'll be talking about step by step, I think it's more looking into your own settings and your own problems. Now, for setting up in countries where osteopath is not regulated, I don't know. All three of us work in countries where it is regulated. I don't know if any of you two can talk about of what we need to be careful of.
I can, because obviously osteopathy is regulated in Australia, but we have set up PBRNs for non-regulated health professions. I will just quickly on the point of the guidelines. I think if anything, what we'd have is a set of questions to answer for yourself as a guideline, not actually a set of actions to take as a guideline. I think that's probably the thing to keep in mind with that. But yes, look, it is a challenge if you're dealing with a non-registered health profession. The way that we decided to go about that is two methods. One is that when we collected data around for the baseline survey, we included a series of questions that allowed us to filter by level of qualification and experience and those kinds of things. So and because of the lack of registration, I mean I'm involved in an independent register for naturopathy in Australia. So we have a set of standards that we were applying, but that hadn't been, at the time we were setting up Practi, it had not been probably accepted through the profession either as a set of standards. And we were still in the process of getting some buy-in on them. And so we didn't feel like it was appropriate for us to make the determination of who was and wasn't in the profession. But instead of asking people in the first instance what profession they belonged to, or we asked them what qualifications they had, and we used the qualifications to determine whether or not they fit into a category of a profession. It did cause some little frustrations for some people if they had multiple qualifications that they listed but weren't actually practicing against. And so we've had to modify that for our refresh of our second wave of Practi recruitment to include profession and qualification. But we still feel like that qualification is really important to capture that information. It doesn't, of course, stop people from lying, but you can't get away from that anyway in a self-reported survey. So that's probably the main thing I can say, is that in some ways, providing some questions that allow you to identify people that are more qualified. And it also means that people undertaking the research, if they only want people who've been in practice for a certain number of years, or only want people who've been trained in a certain country, or only want people who've got a certain level of qualification to be responding to their survey, then they can do that. Also, then you can target those people through an invitation if you're taking a sub-study approach like we did. But it also means that if you're not, we've actually used some of that data to help progress our calls for registration in our country by being able to show any differences in practice behaviours or differences in skill sets and knowledge and experience based on these levels of qualification and those kinds of things as well. So I guess this is another one that there's lots of different ways you can approach it. And I think the main thing, just like with most research, being aware of what the limitations bring by dealing with a profession that's unregistered and figuring out what you can do to help sort of offset some of those limitations. So how do you make sure that you know the degree, the appropriateness of the people who you're including in your PBRN?
Thank you, Amy. Jerry, did you have anything to add? And Gerald, let us know in case there's some missing points, or if you would have you'd require additional information on any of these. And Patrick asked a question. So do PBRN members pay dues, or are all costs borne by the supporting institutes or institutions?
I can start, and Amy can, I'm sure, add more to that. But I guess one way of looking at PBRN members are like participants to a research project. So in essence, they are going to be like when we are trying to recruit after having ethics approval for a project, they will be like these research participants. So they're not going to pay to take part to research. Usually they wouldn't be paid for taking part in research, but they might be compensated. And as described earlier, there are different ways that can be done. It can be done in nature by accessing free training, for example, or if really there was a high time commitment involved, then they could receive funding for that. In the UK, there are quite clear guidance on how much a research participant can be paid to make sure that it's not an incentive that makes it unfair, that people who are from disadvantaged financial background would be more pushed to participate, so that we ensure their autonomy into deciding and taking part in a project, but they can still be financially compensated if it was using a lot of their time. Amy, do you want to add something maybe to that?
No, that's pretty much it. You've nailed it, Jerry. That's you won't get buy-in if you're asking them to pay. The funding has to come from outside of the practitioners. Now, that doesn't mean they can't indirectly fund it by being members of the association that's paying for it, for example. But you don't want to be asking individuals to cough up money for it. You won't get them being involved. You're on mute, Paul.
Sorry. So Yannick Flecker told us, thank you for this very interesting presentation. I just have a question. You just related to the quality and trustworthiness of responses you collect through the PBRN. How do you assess this on several surveys? Not judging about lies, but responses could be oriented.
Do you want to answer this, Jerry? I can. That's fine.
Please do.
Well, this is just a risk. It's a risk of self-report surveys around the world, basically. And I think the way that the only way we can address it, A, is just acknowledging that it's a limitation, but B, being aware of how the invitation to participate is framed. Just as an example, at the moment, we have a survey going out for osteopathy, looking at the role that osteopaths play in preventative health in Australia. Now, there's actually a critical the reason this project is being conducted is Australia's just released the National Preventative Health Strategy, and so this we're looking to see the degree with osteopaths engaging in activities that address that strategy. Now, we haven't mentioned that in our recruitment and invitation material, and a lot of osteopaths would have no idea that there is a strategy that's been released because they're busy providing care with their patients. So we've been very careful not to emphasize the importance that the information that they're going to be providing will have for the profession, because we don't want them to be inspired to, over-egg the custard to say more than is actually the case, or to orient in a particular way. It's also, I think, just being aware that even just when I'm writing up survey results, I'm always very clear to say that participants reported doing things, not that they did certain things. So they identified as having expertise in women's health doesn't mean they do have expertise in women's health. So I just think that it's just important in all elements of when you're reporting the survey that you are relying entirely on their word, and that you engage with the data that arises from that, with that in mind. So you set the survey up so that it is as neutral as possible. And certainly when in getting people engaged with the PBRN surveys in particular, we absolutely were in trying to be inspirational, but our inspiration was really, this is your opportunity to show what your practice is like, so that when we're providing overviews and understandings of what osteopathy in Australia looks like, your practice is reflected in that data, and so there's not much, that's not really asking them to be more, it's just asking them to be involved. And I think that you can find that balance a little bit, but ultimately your question, Yannick, is a valid one. It's just the limitations of self-report, and the only way you can do things to offset it, but you can't remove it entirely from these sorts of studies.
Yeah, so in certain surveys, what we've done is you can take a random sample and ask them to respond a second time and see whether answers are consistent one time to another, which doesn't pretend to stop them from answering falsely twice. But it also gives whether or not the questions target and whether people are consistent. In one of the surveys we ran, we asked a small sample to give us anonymized copies of patient records, because we were asking many questions that were drawn from patient records, and we wanted to see how much of these data were actually from memory and what was written in the reports, which made it possible to show that in the sample we had, there was most of the information we were asking about were not in the report. So we know it's more based on memory, and memory might not be as good as it is when reporting things from patients. So I think there's different methods depending of each study you're running, and that it is something that research and also the PBRN might need to consider as quality from the research, making sure that these issues are addressed in a way they can. And indeed, they can't be removed, but they can be quantified or just to see to what extent it might influence the results.
Just to add a minor point, also it depends on the survey that would be used. I mean, we've all seen surveys, circulating, which are the way that the questions are phrased don't really give much option about the answer you can provide. You can imagine if a question was, do you think osteopathy can help patients with asthma? You might have some osteopaths saying no, but it's very likely that a large majority of osteopaths would say yes. So depending who you are going to ask, the way you are going to phrase questions is very important. And that's where working with other colleagues, piloting a questionnaire, and there are different techniques that can be done for that. And also, if it went through an ethics committee, they would look at the phrasing of the question then, and they would query when you have a question that is quite loaded. And if you use a questionnaire that is already validated, I'm thinking, for example, the pain attitude belief scale, because of Amy's, one of the 5 topics was around, pain attitudes. And there is always the response bias, because the ones who are interested in pain are the ones who are going to take part in your survey. And then there might be some sort of social desirability in some of the answers they might provide. But nevertheless, if this tool has been validated, used in other professions, then you can compare. But ultimately, at the end, following the techniques that Paul mentioned, ultimately, you might have to triangulate your data, and you might do another study that might use a different design and will try maybe through qualitative work, sampling, some of the participants to understand a bit more deeply some of the answers. So there are always ways, but what you're saying is completely true and is not specific to PBRN, but more to surveys in general, I guess.
So I have another question I think that would be really interesting for us. And it's more related to some of us who are carrying PBRNs forwards, but we might not yet have links to either associations or we might be in institutions. And what would your first attitudes, or how would you actually have associations or institutions engage in the project? So even in your own institution, how do you convince the institution that it's a really good idea to invest in PBRNs?
I would say it's probably one of the hardest parts of setting up a PBRN. So I wouldn't start personally setting up a PBRN unless I knew I had in some institutional support, and allow for the fact that it might take a couple of years of multiple conversations. And the thing is, it is conversations. It's one-on-one conversations. You need to have a champion, and you need that champion to understand that the vision and the actual process of a PBRN. As I said, even people who know research don't necessarily know PBRNs. And so you have to explain this particular beast that is research infrastructure, not research itself, but also provides data that can be used for research. And it's a bit confusing for people who are not trained in researchers. So find someone who's a visionary, someone who, and that's the other thing, is that particularly if you're dealing with a professional association, you often have a lot of clinicians who are so focused on on the board. You often have clinicians on the board, and they're the ones who are making the decision. So they also don't have research capacity often, and they also don't. They often have a very particular view that comes from being in clinical practice in a room with another person day in, day out, and that's kind of the world that they are living in. And one of the things that has helped me greatly in the work that I've done is I did my master's in public health, and that gives you a real eagle-eye view of health systems and professions and all sorts of things. And so certainly you need to find the people who've got that bigger picture view so they can understand the value of the infrastructure that you're proposing to be put in place. Certainly we found that with Osteopathy Australia, and we had a champion who was helping to get the rest of the board to understand what it is that we were trying to do.
So there you mentioned a form of time frame, take the time. This is a really important point. So what you're saying is it's worth just moving forwards, mentioning about it, getting more and more allies to show that the project is feasible, and maybe not want to have a project using a PBRN and hurry up to do the PBRN for another project. Would you use, because you mentioned last time that sometimes testing and already creating a network from one survey can be seen as an opportunity for an institution saying, well, we've made one, we've created already a group of participants, and this could be a good opportunity to start a PBRN. Would you use certain studies to maybe host, or do you think it's too biased towards a certain type of study and it's better starting all over again and really recruiting the patients, as you mentioned in the presentation today?
Jerry, do you want to answer this?
Yeah, so I think, again, that is very likely to be context dependent. But I think, for example, if I take the UK as an example, we couldn't do that because once the participants took part in a project, we won't be able to contact them for another project. So in the ethical application, we say when their involvement would be completed, and after that, we can't contact them again. So we couldn't sort of, there's a word I'm looking for, which is like backtrack, back jump.
So we could, if we knew ahead of time, and we could put in the questionnaire at the end, are you interested in participating in another study? Could we contact you? Please add your email address. So I'm thinking if we know that we have like 2 years to convince people, and we do have a study where we're having a network, we could anticipate this point and just ask people saying, in the future, would you be interested in a PBRN, or could we mail you? And they can say yes. So it's including that at the end of a survey.
I don't see an issue with doing this. If I may just backtrack a little bit about the institution and how to engage with them, what I would strongly suggest is, I mean, I'm not a salesman, so I'm not very good with the salesman technique or salesperson technique. But I guess, when you are trying to sell something to someone, you are not going to tell them how wonderful it is for you because you are going to get money out of it and then you can go on holiday and stuff like that. You are going to demonstrate how fantastic it's going to be for them if they buy whatever they buy. So that's basically what you have to do with your institution. rather than telling them how wonderful the infrastructure will allow you to do research projects which are cheap or whatever, they don't care about that. What they will care is what is going to bring to their institution. And I think a good way to approach that, or what I would try to do myself, would be to look at the strategy or the vision of that institution. And because the PBRN is so broad and allows so many things, it should be fairly easy to demonstrate how the PBRN is going to tap in many of their objectives from their strategy, that is for the next 5 years or whatever. And again, I can give examples like that, but that would be, nation dependent and institution dependent. But you might, institutions might be looking at developing their impact, at working on patient engagement, at further developing evidence to promote the profession, whatever the things are, increasing the quality of education, whatever the sort of things you might notice in their strategy. These would be stuff that the PBRN would be fantastic for. So, but I think if you can tap into their needs, that would be much more likely to lead to their willingness to be involved and to support the development of a PBRN.
So if we summarize, you gave us more or less 3 big tips we have to use if we want institutions to engage in a PBRN. The first one is to find someone within the institution that's on the board that can carry and that's has an innovative thought and understands the principle of the PBRN. The second one was to take the time to create this. So even if it takes time to convince and so on. And the third one is really to go and seek into the strategies from the institution to make the project fits in the needs from the institution. Daniel Bailey said, thank you for a really interesting talk. It was discussed that researchers can submit projects to the PBRN for consideration. How can the PBRN members themselves, the clinicians, have a say in the research projects that are conducted within a PBRN?
That's an interesting one.
It is.
Because we've tried numerous avenues for that. Mostly they're not interested in having a say in the projects that are conducted. They just want to get on with their practice and then respond to an invitation. Majority of them just are happy to be involved, but aren't invested in driving any direction or anything like that. We did have a couple of opportunities. We set up a practitioner members forum just on Facebook. At the time, it was the best forum. It was, going on 10 years ago now. And we just invited practitioners who we knew were quite active on Facebook to the members of the PBRN to be involved in that. And then we could kind of contribute to conversation, but even then it wasn't very active. And we would have a practitioner member and an association member involved a little bit in the steering committee as well. And so we could definitely have open channels of communication with regards to that. But by and large, what our experience was is that most clinicians who were reaching out with research project ideas were reaching out with very niche projects. They were very specific, unusual treatments that they themselves had developed that they wanted to see studied, or those kinds of things. And so most of our communication, we have tried multiple angles to open that line of communication. But in general, most clinicians, with not having the research experience and not having any understanding as to how research funding and project, develop, their contributions were very hard to actually follow through anyway. And so we found that just dealing with the association as a voice for the membership, for the profession, and understanding what sort of research the profession needed in order to move forward, rather than what a specific clinician, who often would have very rare contact with other clinicians beyond their own clinical space, that relying on them to tell us what was specifically needed to answer the questions. We always, having said that, we always had osteopaths involved in all of the research projects that have happened through Orion. And so you still have that clinical, training and insight involved in the study, but it's just about them actually having a say in the projects that are conducted within the PBRN. We found that we've opened up that channel of communication, but it wasn't actually really very helpful.
Jerry, is that something you've also experienced, and what's your view about having that bottom-up approach of research?
No, I don't really. This is something that we would like to try at NCORE, but we are still, in the pre-launch of our PBRN, so we haven't really tried that. Um, Part of the PBRN will be also for NCORE ourselves to be, to apply for grant and to be doing projects, the sub-studies like Amy mentioned, ourselves. And that we would like to try to engage with the member to try to decide, the sort of strategize what should be the sort of main topics to go for. But I can't really say, I mean, this is a conversation I have with Dan, but I can't really say because we haven't done that yet, but we would like to try doing it, yeah.
I think it's really worthwhile doing. Sorry, Paul, if I can just sort of follow up on my little point before. It is really worthwhile. I genuinely believe that having bottom-up research is really valuable. The way that we've kind of come about it that in some ways is drawing on clinician data from clinicians, surveys that we've sent out to clinicians about to answer research questions about their practices, and then using that to then prioritize research projects that arise from the PBRN. And that way we're kind of getting a little bit more of a generalized picture, and we understand, this is a condition that isn't treated very often, which is how we were able to identify that was the case. Alternative, what we've also have been able to do though is support osteopaths who are interested in studying PhDs to answer their own questions through the PBRN as well, and being able to facilitate it in that regard. But it is hard. It's hard, and I would love to see how Jerry progresses with it, because he may come at it with a new perspective and have some new solutions that we have not had and not seen before.
So if I summarize, it's probably a few approaches. One, having a just global forums makes it really difficult. But what I hear is qualitative studies that give a voice to practitioners, make it possible to have research topics that emerge that make sense. Maybe the second approach is Delphi approaches that might find a consensus about in a specific topic, and having practitioners join these Delphi approaches to formulate priorities. There's also simply people expressing their feelings of what they need for their practices, like the ProCare survey that we're running now. And I think maybe it's one place that's quite new to research. So we hope to emerge new methods for this bottom-up. And I think PBRNs is an opportunity to make that happen and have new methods come forwards to favor the bottom-up approach. So thank you very much, Daniel, for this really relevant question. I have no more open questions. I don't know if any of you have anything to add, or if anyone else out there has some even more needs some details, or maybe to address some specifics from their countries, or something we might have just not really dug into, and that you're scraping your head thinking, well, how does that apply in my settings or in my country? So don't hesitate to post it right now. And as for a question, was it with the patients you've had setting up, because both of you really have this element saying it takes time, and can you just maybe summarize and what did you get from doing it? So because you had the antidepressant running through, what were the like positive feedbacks in that experience, and what would you retain from the experience of setting up these PBRNs?
Well, I can't really answer that because it's not yet set up, to be fair. But through the interaction we've had with osteopaths, it was lovely so far to see that, excuse my French, but, bloody social media, it gives this image of people always disagreeing with each other and being so divided and, not agreeing on anything at all and all that. And what was really lovely when interacting with the osteopaths, in the last 10 months on that project, is that despite very different approaches to care, using different techniques, some who might be considered as it's going to be judgmental, but on purpose, the words I'm going to use, old-fashioned or dogmatic, and others being really, gurus of evidence-based practice, sort of, extreme on the spectrum. What was really lovely is the sort of passion that came, which is, I think probably was not a big surprise, but also how all of them, wherever they were sitting on the spectrum, were really interested in joining a PBRN. The caveat to that is obviously the ones who came to see us were the ones who were interested. So the ones who are not interested didn't come to our, we did talks, we did CPDs, which were free to access and stuff like that. But nevertheless, there was a really good diversity of profile of osteopaths coming to these, which was really lovely to see. So I guess one of my early anxiety was that we would end up with a sort of very minor demographic of the profession, maybe younger graduates who were a bit more engaged and stuff like that. And in fact, we will see what happens when we start recruiting, but that's not the profile that we had in the last 10 months engaging with us.
So your feeling was that your work has a meaning, and that and that you could share some passion into doing research with practitioner. So it kind of reduced the gap between research and practice.
That, and also hopefully further develop this sense of community within the profession that, I think social media can sometimes be quite brutal.
Show us as divided when we're not really. And Amy?
I think I'm glad Jerry went first. I had a chance to think about it because I've kind of gone through the ups and downs for a little while now. But I think some of the really nice things, ones in the practitioner level, I think it's just presenting some of the research that's arising from the PBRN at a conference and having practitioners come up and say, I did that study. That was me. I was involved in that. That was, and you can see they're excited to see their data up on a screen, And of course, that would be the case for any study. But as a sense of, I guess, of them being involved in that community of PBRN, that there's a bit of identity that goes with that, and so they feel particularly proud. It wasn't just any study. It's just like I always answer to all your invitations to be involved in studies. I love it so much, and it was great to see this one, and it's great seeing that what they get to. Like they love seeing where that result comes to. So it is important, even if to find opportunities to share the results of the research back to the PBRNs, that they can see where it's all going. So that is really nice, and it does feel you can just to see that excitement and the buy-in from the members. Probably the other thing, which is on the other side of it entirely, is to see the amount of research that is now being generated in some of these professions that were previously under-researched, and not to see that research is being generated, but being used, being cited in government submissions to help understand the profession better, and to, this research that we're generating through the PBRNs at relatively low cost once the PBRN's set up, is having real impact and is being used in multiple ways to advance and strengthen and support the profession. And I know Jerry mentioned we've used the word support a lot, but the thing is, it's appropriate because the PBRN, it requires support from multiple areas, and it gives support to multiple areas, and it is really a critical element of what makes a PBRN successful, I think.
Thank you very much for both these answers. I think it does help us want to go into this large engagement, and I think that notion of community, many of us like research because we're curious, and stepping out also of our isolated places, whether we're in research or as a clinician. And I think knowing that there's this place where we can share and engage, I think it's something that we can look forward to and spend the time to set it up properly and take that time. So thank you both. I don't know if, Jerry, you want to talk about what's coming up next, or if you want me to summarize? for the next workshop. Maybe
Yeah.
you present it, because I think it's really interesting because it's linked to the Congress. So I think people who might come to this workshop are also interested to come to the Congress.
Yeah. So
But
the workshop will be on the Thursday. The time will be confirmed, but it's likely to be early afternoon for a couple of hours. I'm just yeah, the confirmation should come very quickly, and we will share that with you by email, and we'll put that on the social media channels as usual. It would be free to attend, obviously, like these two webinars were free to attend. And the idea is really to try to support you into identifying how you can really put that into practice. So for you to be able to attend, we ask that you work within an institution. So you might not have yet the support from your institution to develop that PBRN, but you need to have a link with an institution. If you are, a clinician isolated in your practice and you don't have these connections yet, I think this workshop is likely to be less relevant to you. But if you don't have that connection with an institution and you think you should be attending for whatever the reason, then do contact Paul, drop him an email, and you can discuss your situation. And then, Paul will assess whether he thinks it would be worth for you coming, because at the end of the day, it's so that you don't waste your time and, you don't travel to the UK just for that. So as I said, the workshop will be on the Thursday afternoon probably, and then on the Friday and Saturday will be this international conference. As I said, that is organized by UCO, NCO, and the IO in collaboration with the OIS, the Osteopathic International Association, and Osteopathy Europe. So it's a multi-stream conference, so there are several rooms running at the same time. So it'll be a very busy conference. We expect several hundred delegates. And if you want to come, you can book your tickets directly onto the Institute of Osteopathy website. And it's done in a hotel in Heathrow. So if you fly, which you shouldn't because it kills the planet, you can fly directly to Heathrow, and you can sleep in the hotel where the convention is. But you can sleep elsewhere if you want to, but it's quite handy.
And maybe for our organization, if you're interested, it's just a booking also on the COMA webinar page, so that we know how many people are attending, and that we can make sure that we can welcome you as appropriate. So thank you very much, Jerry and Amy, for your insights. I think this presentation was really interesting. I think we got more in depth into the topic. I spent an hour and a half where time flew past. Thank you, Amy, for getting up so early a second time. And we're looking forward that you'll be at the UK time in our next meeting, and you won't have to get up so early. Thank you for all the attendees for being there and for your questions. And I look really forward to seeing you and hearing from you again. Bye.
Thanks, Paul, for chatting. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.